Mm-hmm. I think so.
Bill? Hey, Bill. Good. Okay, folks, we're going to get started for this afternoon. I would like to introduce Elizabeth Wharton, whose talk is FAA, FTC, FCC, Fired Up, How 3 Effing Agencies Are Shaping InfoSec.
Thanks, Liz. Okay. Getting used to the mic, so I apologize if the volume sounds very loud or not. Just tell me if you can't hear. But as the name of the talk suggests, we're going to spend the next 25 minutes looking at how the FAA, FTC, and the FCC, 3 effing agencies, are impacting information security. And as Mo just said, my name is Elizabeth Wharton. I'm an attorney who works in transactions and public policy. And so I always laugh, I am an attorney, I am not your attorney. While I'm a lawyer, I'm not going to help you solve the mystery of what grits are. I'm not going to represent you. I'm not going to necessarily talk about Utes. Instead, I've been working for the past 12 years in the public policy arena. Started off in Washington, D.C. as a legislative aide to a member of Congress from Georgia, helping him on technology issues. Then went to law school and practiced in the information security technology startup space, helping companies get off the ground, as well as working with the Georgia Technology Association of Georgia and serving as a liaison on public policy issues. I've also worked in-house with an information security startup that tended to have, that liked to cause trouble, shall we say, and worked on getting them out. But, sorry, as we start looking at the Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Communications Commission, really, why do we care? Why have they suddenly picked up an interest in information security, data privacy? And really the best way to say it is they want to be beltline ballers. They want the money, they want the fame, they want the politics and the power. So what exactly does that mean? It means big budgets. That suddenly information security, data privacy are on forefront of everyone's minds. And you're going to see an emerging theme for this between the agencies. It's going to be the information collection, the connection to the use, and the expectation. What is the expectation of privacy, safety, security? And you see this through development, disclosure, and direction. How are these agencies suddenly coming into the space and impacting the development of both devices as well as software and systems? And disclosure. How are they changing what is, how you disclose, and what exactly you are disclosing? They also are impacting the direction, as where's the direction both information security is going, as well as direction of what the agencies themselves are handling. And again, doing this through the money, the fame, the politics. We're talking big budgets. Once the FCC announced their net neutrality rules, fiscal year 2016 budgets came out. After announcing that the FCC was going to enter into the regulating the broadband internet service providers, including the information security part of it, they requested an additional, $73 million in their budget for fiscal year 2016. And part of this relates to they're opening some new offices. They've got they're going to have the construction costs. But at the same time, that's a 22% increase in their requested funding. You look at the FTC, Federal Trade Commission has been very active lately. They've requested an additional $16 million for fiscal year 2016. So, all right, we see some of the dollars that they're talking about, but what are they doing for the fame, the spotlight? Suddenly, agencies that were overlooked, not unless you were in that area, that space, you didn't pay attention to them. Now they're on the front page. Now they're having hearings. Now the commissioners for the FCC are Twitter rock stars, so to speak. They're out there, they're promoting themselves, whereas before they did not necessarily take quite the headline approach. But then you start to talk about the politics. Once you get inside the Beltline, it's all dollars and politics, and it's the political power. So you have administrations where the commissioners, for example, the FAA's administrative head, he's a political appointee. He's appointed for a 5-year term. You look at the Federal Trade Commission. Commissioners are White House appointees, and they start serving 5-year terms. With the FTC, again, all White House appointees that serve 7-year terms. So they're backing the policies of the party, perhaps, that brought them to power. Well, that's great, except for the parties change. And as they change, the missions change. And keeping up with that, they're also targeting their base. So once you start with that understanding that they're after the money, they're after the budget battle, they're fighting for the same piece of the pie, and they're also targeting and going to the methods through which they were appointed, you start to get some of the background. And before we get too far into the talk, I wanted to go through and make sure we're all on the same page, what we are and what we are not necessarily going to talk about today. So when we talk about InfoSec, we're just talking about the data. We're talking about the personal information, but as well as just the information that's being transmitted back and forth. It can be anything from, when we start talking about the FAA, the aviation, it's the flight data. It's that information that's being collected. And when we start getting into the FTC and the FCC again, it's just that. It's not necessarily, I'm not going to delve into during this talk, mention the political parties. We're going to leave the politics aside, other than just noting that's what's driving a lot of their actions. We're not necessarily going to get into a big ethical debate. For example, when we start talking about disclosures. They are what they are. That's another talk, another day. That requires buying me a round of drinks. When we talk about the FAA, keep in mind its core is aviation. When we talk about the FTC, again, its core is trade. We talk about, and I'll reference it because I do get tripped up between all the effing agencies on which one I'm talking about at different times. So if I mention the Trade Commission, obviously FTC, Communications, FCC. And if you keep that straight 3 times in a row, you're doing good. So kind of, now that we have a little bit of the groundwork, what we are going to talk about, what we're not, you have to look at each agency from its core. What is its mission? What is it out to do? What has it been charged with? And then how is it implementing that right now? So we're going to break down each of the agencies, go through those, and then talk a little bit about where some of the battlegrounds are emerging, and then what's next. And then hopefully, if I don't talk too fast or too slow, leave time if anyone has any questions we can go through for follow-up. So looking at the FAA, its mission is safety in the national airspace. That's it. It's not information security safety. They have been focused up until recently on just the actual aircraft safety. They've been looking at, for example, and tripping over themselves, so to speak, as they roll out how to implement drones, the unmanned aerial systems, into the airspace. The drones with the little sensors. They're collecting all this information, all this data. That's still in the works. But as the GAO released a report back earlier this year, you heard about, well, what about the safety? What about all this? What about the security of this information, the security of the systems, the planes themselves, and all of the data that is going back and forth? And again, not getting into the ethics of the disclosure stuff, but you have security researchers who are pointing out that mid-flight, I can access, the systems. I can take over this plane. Well, what the FAA is not designed to do, and what the GAO report pointed out, the FAA is not designed to immediately respond to a security issue on the information security, on the data, on the system side. The FAA knows what to do if there's an issue with the plane's structure. But, for example, when Boeing was pointed out for the Boeing 787s, there's an issue with if they're left running for 287 days without a reboot, there's a software glitch that comes up. Well, there's a reason you don't want to necessarily have to restart the plane systems. It takes a long time to power it down, to power it back up, to go through that. So it's reasonable to expect that for 287 days, it may not get rebooted. Well, there's a software glitch that can cause a problem with the plane. So now the FAA knows about this, but they're not equipped to handle it. So that's one of the issues they're struggling with, because again, they're focused on safety, not necessarily security. And we know it's all ball bearings these days. It's all security, that every device is connected. Everything is working together. And what's happening to this data? So the FAA's slow approach, both with the drones and all that technology, was also highlighted by when you have a researcher pointing out that here is a vulnerability. Here's where I can take over a system, whether legitimately or not. The FAA is not prepared to handle a malicious actor who's coming in. They can handle someone breaking into a cockpit and dealing with it that way. We all got searched TSA when we came through. FAA can deal with that. But they don't know what to do when someone calls and says, hey, I have a vulnerability, or this information is out there. So they don't have this disclosure. They don't have a response mechanism. And once they've approved a system, once they've approved an airplane, that's it. They've approved it. They're not going to require the follow-ups yet. So that's one of the issues to keep an eye on. How do they work that in? Because right now, you point out a vulnerability, and they're just not equipped, again, to handle it. Then again, you also have to look at the data. All this data that's being collected when, for example, the drones, the sensors are going overhead. Who owns that? Is it FAA responsible for, do they have oversight? No, they're not ready to do that. They're not prepared to. But the problem then becomes, how do you secure it? Because you're having that information that's coming in. So one of the issues with, I keep going back to the drones, so the UASs testing. If you're using an FAA-approved test site, they do have regulations requiring that the data be stored securely. After 180 days, it gets purged, and you have to have a policies mechanism in place. So if you're researching and you're doing testing on a test site, keep that in mind. But similarly, for federal agencies, back in February, the White House issued an executive order that requires for federal agencies using unmanned systems, using the drones, they have to follow those same rules. Similarly, they have to develop policies for the data security. They have to purge the information after 180 days if it's not tied to an active investigation. If you have to, it has to be data that is reasonably, there has to be a reasonable connection. And you'll see this theme come up with each of these agencies. It's the expectation. It's the, is there a connection? What is being collected? What is being stored? And would you expect this agency to handle this? But again, when you have issues with both the airspace, that's one thing. But when you start getting into the devices in the airspace, we start to move to the Federal Trade Commission, because the FTC's job is to protect consumers. So preventing fraud, deception, and unfair business practices in the marketplace. So again, generally speaking, they're looking at, and under the FTC's Authorization Act, their focus, again, they're regulating, but only so far. They're looking at unfair, deceptive trade practices. So you see what's missing from this? Security. They're looking, again, at the competition. They're not, again, focused on this. So while they've tried and they've been working on it, again, it's a bit of a stretch. No one's sure exactly how they're supposed to enact this. And what they've been doing is they've been looking at, for example, they released in January their Internet of Things report, looking at development and protection of devices as they're connecting. So again, their focus has started shifting a little bit from the safety to the security. And by that, they're still constrained by the regulations under which the FTC Act. So they're having to maneuver within a space. For example, with their report, they've started identifying issues where, for example, looking to vendors to maintain minimum standards and defense in depth strategy so that you have multi-layers of defending. And again, these are just suggestions, because how does the FTC, enforce it? Fines and a recall. They'll send you a nasty gram letter. They'll investigate. They may pull a product, require you to pull a product off the market. But really, what are they going to do? They can't force, to some extent, what's going on. So they've asked that manufacturers then look at the devices. If you can prevent access to them, a process by which to patch through the life cycle of it. They've announced a new office that will be looking at research and investigations, looking at how technology advances are impacting consumers. But one of the questions is, do they still have jurisdiction? Because again, they're operating under the guise of the FTC Act. Well, that's great, except the FTC Act expressly prohibits going into where the FCC has now come in with their net neutrality. And what do I mean by that? So what's happened is the common carriers are expressly excluded from the FTC's jurisdiction. Well, as anyone who may have been watching the news over the last couple months, FCC, the Communications Commission, proposed and finally got through, and as of June 12th have gone into effect their net neutrality rules. And we'll get into in a second what exactly that means. But again, look at the FCC's mission, because they can only impact what they're doing based on what their expanse of their authority. So with the FCC, they're regulating the interstate and international communications via radio, television, wire, satellite, and cable. Again, they're focusing on the safety and the ensuring the communications. They're not really looking at the security. But with the net neutrality rules, they're showing, and they've announced couple of the commissioners have pointed out that they're going to start focusing on security. But again, this was previously in the FTC's domain. In the FTC, they were looking at the Samsung televisions that were recording conversations that were going on unless you disabled the voice-activated devices or systems on the televisions. Well, the FTC came in and said, no, that data is being stored somewhere, it's not being deleted, and consumers don't expect their TV to constantly be recording what they're doing. And the TVs were set to pick up every conversation or every voice-activated sound that was going on in the room. Well, okay, but now you've got the FCC coming in saying, we're going to start looking at privacy and security. So FTC instigated a $25 million fine against AT&T for call center data. And with that, they were looking at what, again, did you allow access to the systems? Did you, in that case, personal information was allowed to the call center. Well, okay, that was transmitting personal information, but that's great. What about this whole net neutrality thing? And it impacts wireless and fixed broadband service providers. What is an ISP? Pardon my graphic skills, but AT&T, Verizon, Google Fiber, Comcast, Cox, Time Warner, if you're providing the services, you're an internet service, you're a broadband provider, and you fall under net neutrality. You're not an ISP if you're Netflix, if you're Facebook, perhaps. Google is a search engine, YouTube, the VoIP services. Where it gets interesting is Facebook announced in the last week that they have drones that are ready to deploy that will be able to provide internet services. Well, by doing so, that's going to start putting Facebook as an ISP provider under net neutrality. With net neutrality, you have to be upfront. You have to say, these are the pricing policies, these are the data speeds, this is everything we have. That there's no throttling, there's no slowing down, giving priority. But again, it's just the internet service providers, and it doesn't get to that last mile. It also doesn't get to the edge services. So by Facebook operating the drones and then leasing them out, does it somehow put them as an ISP provider under net neutrality? If you're not an ISP provider, you're not broadband, right now as a company, you don't care as much about net neutrality because it doesn't apply to you as much. From someone at home, sure, it's keep an eye, watch your billing, make sure that your speeds aren't getting slowed down, but that's about all it does. Well, okay, but not really, because you start getting into a little bit more and you deal with whether there are the call data information. So what numbers you're calling, when you're calling them, under the FCC's rules and under net neutrality, that information, you can request that they not store it. So every month when your phone bill comes in and it lists out what numbers you called, you can request some of that information to be deleted. But how that impacts with the FTC and the FCC, whole other story, because again, by net neutrality, made internet service providers common carriers. Said, we're bringing them back in. By making them common carriers, it took them out of the Trade Commission's jurisdiction. Trade Commission Act expressly says, nope, we're not, we have no authorization over common carriers. Well, great, so now we know what happens to your call data at the beginning if it's FCC. But what about the data privacy? What about the information that's being transmitted? And if you're doing research, how are you able to then go? So really the FAA, FTC, and FCC essentially aren't equipped to handle what happens when malicious actors, when you're doing research and you report something. They don't have the response abilities to come in. And in the case of the FTC, one of the issues they had was they were investigating a privacy breach with LabMD. LabMD's, a vendor came, said, found 10,000 patient records on the internet. They're investigating them. They go, great, but information, again, came through a vendor. Through further investigation, there's allegations, and currently the Department of Justice is looking into it. The vendor was the one who actually released the information. So you've got that FTC investigation underway. A vendor who had legitimate access to the information put the documents, leaked them online. And FTC doesn't have a response mechanism to pull it back. LabMD, who through members of congressional testimony, the investigation, it's apparent they actually didn't do anything. They were meeting their protocols. They were doing what they were supposed to be doing. But the problem is they're now out of business. FTC investigation, no way to pull it back, no way to handle what happens when someone lies, when someone puts that information out there. So as a researcher, you have to be aware of that. And again, they're trying to figure out the plan. They're looking into it. The FCC, FTC, or both. But the problem is who has the jurisdiction, what systems you're talking about, and being able to adapt to take over and provide disclosure opportunities and fixes. So I think we're just about out of time. So if anyone has any questions, happy to go through anything or highlight, talk about it afterwards. Yes.
So if drones are the thing providing service, does that mean Facebook is now under FAA rules?
Who knows? And that's the problem. They're not equipped because the FAA is looking, and the FAA doesn't have a mechanism to respond to and control the data. All they can tell you is, well, the drone's up there. It's in the airspace. Okay. But I can take over. I can take over that drone. I can crash it.
Please don't.
Exactly. We'd ask that you not. But I can get the data from that. And the data, I can tell it to pick up additional data. Please be kind to it and don't do that. I mean, that's they just don't have it and they don't know what to do with it. And so that is kind of the quagmire and why they're not permitting drones, or one of the issues they're dealing with the drones. Yes?
So does the government know this gap? What's the action plan? Anything to harmonize does Obama has a plan?
In order, because it's all budgets, and that's the problem is everyone says, well, we're going to do this, and the FTC. I've had the privilege of being on a conference call where you have one of the FTC commissioners up in arms over the FCC is coming into our data privacy. We're going to do something about it. And that was we're going to look into this. We're going to have a study committee. Well, okay. But again, if I've done research and I want to know what can I do? Can I research this? Can I look into this? And they don't know. It's the gap that they have yet to close. It's the mountain they haven't climbed yet.
Is there any existing case law defining boundaries between the different agencies more clearly? When you talk about something like FCC is definitely focused on communication, well, there's communication going on, but I know the FAA also gets some control of communication in respect to airspace and communication across the air control towers and systems of that nature that are communicating and restricting certain bandwidths that are reserved to them that the FCC has been excluded from and cannot lease out to other places. Is there any clarity in the case law that helps define which agencies should be handling which types of devices a little better?
And unfortunately, if we think government moves slow, case law tends to move slower. And so one of the most recent with the with the FTC and FCC's fight over common carriers, one of the recent AT&T fines dealt with, and it was pre-net neutrality. So, and net neutrality is still being fought out in the court. I mean, appeals were filed most recently this week. Yeah, and one of the issues was, well, if you're doing non-common carrier things, then do you then fall under the FTC? Do we still uphold the FCC's fine against, and this was another AT&T, because they were doing non-common carrier things? Well, the clarification of, well, you're definitely a common carrier, it's still going through the appeals process. So right now, the fine stands. But that's part of the problem, is that no one necessarily anticipated, well, what happens? I mean, what also happens with the FAA and the FCC with the whole battle over the spectrum and where the spectrum intersects. I mean, the FCC can't figure out what to do with the spectrum right now themselves. Good luck. So the court cases, again, haven't caught up and are still dealing with it.